Okay, thank you. Thanks for the invitation, very much appreciated. Not quite sure how the acoustics are going to work out, but since I used to be a bad amateur actor, I can be as loud or as soft as you like. So if you'd like me to go loud, I can go loud. So I made three basic claims in Republic of Equals, a book that was revealingly too large for me to bring in my luggage. The first was that our best overall normative political theory is a distinctive intellectual hybrid that I call liberal republicanism. So liberalism and republicanism are usually opposed to each other, but I claimed that was a mistake. I also said that this view leads to one and only one institutional specification at the level of what Rawls called our choice of a social system. So this is kind of bold. We Platonic constitution writers think if you're going to implement justice, there's only one way to do it, and that's in a property-owning democracy. And the methodology in play here was precisely what this workshop is about. It's Philippe van Parijs's model of, quotes, social justice-guided constitutional engineering, which trips off the tongue very easily. So this whole summer school is about whether that kind of project makes sense, right? Whether the philosophers should be dictating the form of the Constitution, and then the Constitution should be constraining our choice of a social system. So it's really, is this conditional true? There's only one way to implement justice as reciprocal fairness, and that way is the institutions and policies characteristic of a property-owning democracy. So I'm very happy my book got reviewed. Doesn't happen very often. On the whole, very pleased with the reviews, but I think there are definitely some lines of concern where people would like me to clarify, what on earth does this guy think he's doing? First concern, let me pick out four. First concern, misplaced exclusivity. It's not true that justice leads to one and only one social system. And now things get interesting, come ironic. So Rawls actually says that when you implement justice as fairness, you face a disjunctive choice between property-owning democracy or the kind of liberal market socialism he found in Mill. But it was not up to the philosopher or the constitution writer to resolve that choice for you. So each society would resolve that choice in the light of knowledge of its own history and traditions. So I think Rawls is wrong. I think we can, at the level of constitution writing, resolve that disjunction in one way. Property-owning democracy and not liberal market socialism. Bill has a position that is the mirror image of mine. So first of all, he substitutes in liberal democratic socialism for liberal market socialism, but then says, no, we don't face a disjunctive choice between liberal democratic socialism and property-owning democracy. It's really just liberal democratic socialism. So there are Rawlsian grounds for writing the constitution of a just society where the public owns the commanding heights of the economy, the major means of production. And that's what a reading of Rawls mandates. So Bill and I agree Rawls was wrong to leave this disjunctive and wrong to leave this as something that's resolved in the legislature in the light of our own history and traditions. So we both think he was wrong about that, but we've got mirror image views of which way you resolve the disjunction. So the second critique is really, this is way too close to capitalism. So I have a couple of Marxist critics, Nicholas Vroussalis and Paul Rakestead, who say this is too close to original capitalism, and in particular it admits the exploitation of people who have to labor for a wage. I think fairly closely related is something Lisa Herzog says, which is this view is just too vague. So it claims to be defending one kind of social system from alternatives, but there's no way of doing that, because these are all very vague and they all overlap. And there is no meaningful project of contrasting a property-owning democracy with, for example, welfare state capitalism. And finally, Thomas seems to have it in for workplace democracy. This is attacking a shibboleth of the left. So understandably, they didn't like that chapter at all, right? So I'm too down on workplace democracy. So in this paper, I'm just going to try and follow up a bit and address some of these objections, and as you might predict, say why I don't think they're really very good objections, because that's the way the game is played. So let's start, since this is a philosophy paper, with quibbling over methodology. So underpinning a lot of these objections is something Keith Dowding and Paul Weitman say, which is this is just a very bad way to do political philosophy. Because you're starting out by saying, we're going to compare and contrast something like Weber's ideal types. That's an idea with a very long history in German philosophy. It goes back to Goethe and Schiller, arguing over whether you could find the primal plant, right? The Urpflanze. Could you go in your garden and find one, right? This runs all the way through to like Wittgenstein, discussions of the role of ideal types and ideal typical thinking. So, look, it's a kind of false abstraction. It's a false abstraction. It'll lead you to say the kind of ridiculous thing Thomas says, which is we can contrast property-owning democracy and welfare state capitalism, suggesting they can be wholly distinct. So the error of false abstraction is you start treating these ideal types as mutually exclusive when they're not. So unsurprisingly, the counterclaim is, look, let's look at the actual history of welfare state capitalisms, plural, that have evolved in different ways in different societies. You'll find an historically determined patchwork of institutions and policies. And that's not a surprise, because they emerge from contingent and shifting resolutions between interests and power. So, you know, if some of you read Marx's book, this is tracing out different kinds of social settlements that have produced different kinds of welfare state capitalisms, notably in Sweden and the USA, to give you the biggest contrast, right? But on any reasonable view, this is not going to really contrast markedly with the institutions of a property-owning democracy. So if you follow Rawls and say, look, let's compare property-owning democracy and welfare state capitalism and be critics of welfare state capitalism, because Rawls is a critic of welfare state capitalism. He says it's structurally unjust and cannot be made just. You can't sustain that argument because you really couldn't draw that distinction in the first place. Okay, well, I'm going to stick by something I said in the book, which is actually I object to that argument. Because it says, look, let's take two social systems, let's isolate what they have in common. Let's pick out their highest common factor. And they're really very similar. So let's pick out the core that they share. And now we've got this interesting fork in the road. So my colleague Martin O'Neill at York says, property-owning democracy is a hybrid. It's welfare state capitalism plus some asset-based policies. So the welfare state capitalist has been insufficiently attentive to assets and wealth. So, you know, if you look at a Scandinavian country we admire for its egalitarian credentials, you'll say, yes, very good on equality of income, not so great on equality of wealth. So when we detect these very, very wealthy families in Sweden, or very wealthy families in Germany, and when we note how that plays into class, and when we see how that plays into things like educational opportunity and elite schooling, okay, maybe we egalitarians needed to broaden our focus, move away from income inequality, start talking about wealth inequality. But a property-owning democracy is basically a hybrid view. It's welfare state capitalism with some asset-based policies thrown in. Now, if that's the view, then that attracts a certain kind of criticism. So I suggested you read Kevin Vallier's paper on property-owning democracy for this seminar. There's an earlier paper by Kevin from 2015. In his 2019 paper, he seems sympathetic to the kind of version of property-owning democracy I defend. But in the earlier paper, he was much more critical because that was the hybrid version that Martin defends. So if you've got Kevin's kind of Arizona-style instincts, then Martin's hybrid is everything that's wrong with welfare state capitalism an affirmative welfare state that interferes too much with individual liberty. And now we add some more interferences in the domain of assets. And that's even worse, because asset prices tell you where you should be investing. And in Kevin's kind of system, private capitalists will be determining the course of investment. So you really don't want to have the state messing with those signals, right? So for Kevin, if welfare state capitalism is a hybrid, then it's twice as bad as it was originally. There's a completely different path where you say, let's isolate the highest common factor between property-owning democracy and welfare state capitalism. Really, property-owning democracy is what they wholly don't share. So Christian Schemmel looks at property-owning democracy and says, yeah, okay, I recognize this kind of view. It's a guarantee of your basic liberties, and then all you get is starting gate equality of opportunity. And that's it. Perhaps I'll give you a demogrant. Perhaps I'll give you a stake on the market. Then I push you out there, and it's up to you how you do. The resulting distribution will be responsibility sensitive. Now, he has in mind Ackerman and Allstott's version of stakeholder capitalism. Okay, so this can tie into a very distinctively American ideology of meritocracy. So responsibility might be cashed out as intellectual merit. Okay, but it's a very kind of minimalist view. I guarantee you the basic liberties. I guarantee you a level playing field. I give you a demogrant, then I push you out there. And now it's down to your individual appetite for risk, your capacity for responsible decision, and good or bad market luck. So my friend John Tomasi thinks that anyone brought up in a welfare state capitalist society is, quote, morally stunted because we're insufficiently exposed to risk. It's kind of Corey Robin kind of picture of the economy as a kind of place of character, of glory, right? When you see those people grab that takeout coffee in the morning, you think, who the hell do they think they are? As they stride off, they're playing a kind of role. Right? This is me, the producer. This is me, the heroic producer. So John thinks, look, if you've got the state mollycoddling you, you're really not the kind of person you could be. So in this interpretation, on Christian Schemmel's interpretation of property-owning democracy, this is going to look like a kind of an American picture of a merely residual welfare state capitalism, just because it's embarrassing to step over dead bodies on your way to work, right? So, that's it. The imprudent, the unlucky, or the simply untalented will get residual welfare provision, but the state is going to play a very minimal role here. Not quite the night watchman, but not much more than the night watchman. So look, in the book I just said welfare state capitalism and property-owning democracy have got nothing interesting in common. So don't start with this highest common factor story. Got two holistic systems. They don't share anything. I didn't write a 450-page book about baby bonds, right? If you go down Martin's path and say, look, it's welfare state capitalism with some asset-based stuff thrown in. Oh, and Alan says he's a pre-distributionist. So I hear pre temporally. I hear pre as early stages intervention. I hear pre as no child left behind. I hear pre as building up educational opportunity. Okay, and that's all a liberal can do. Okay, we can't touch the market. We can't structure the market. All we can do is educate. So this is all about early years interventions. Okay, so on this hybrid view, property-owning democracy ends up as just being like baby bonds, right? Well, no, it's not just about baby bonds, right? But what we're getting to here is this is an issue about what's the function of a state in a property-owning democracy. So Martin's got a later paper that he wrote with Emily McTurnan, with Fabian Schuppert and with Christian Schemmel saying, look, you need a big state. Unapologetically, this hybrid view is going to require not just a big affirmative welfare state, an even bigger affirmative welfare state. And that's just agreeing with Kevin Vallier about what the implications are of this view. Christian seems to think the kind of Ackerman-Allstott version is really a shrinking of the state to something that looks neoliberal. What is it? Are we talking about big states, small states, or smart states? What do I mean by a smart state? Well, the third way, what was the third way conception of the smart state? Well, how is the state going to adjust itself to the demands of globalization? Insofar as that was meeting the terms for entry to the international market order dictated by the global hegemon, the United States. So this is the Washington Consensus, which I always say should have been stamped for export only. Okay. The US operates by a completely different set of rules, kind of corporatist socialism, right? Socialism for giant corporations, but that's at home. Okay. What we're going to impose, if you want to join the international market order, different set of rules for you. Okay? But if you want to join the club, if you want to join the team, our club, our rules, you've got to flexibilize your labor market, shrink the state, and do everything we say you have to do to produce access to your markets for international corporations. So a great deal of the third way rhetoric is actually about what do you have to do to be competitive in a global economy structured for you by someone else. So now the issues are, how mercantilist are your goals? To what extent from gains from trade available for domestic compensation? So I used to teach in the Netherlands. The Netherlands is an extremely open economy, very, very strong social protections. That's the deal, right? We've got these global traders with incredibly strong welfare state. Look at the United States, completely opposite. Totally open, no domestic compensation. Right, lousy welfare state. How are you trying to position yourself on the global marketplace? Are you going to be the symbolic analysts who produce the knowledge-intensive capital goods while the Chinese make the washing machines? So, you know, we've heard this story 1,000 times, right? There's going to be division of labor at the global level. So we in the affluent West, we're going to be the knowledge workers, and all those consumer goods are going to come in from China, but we're going to contribute the capital-intensive, knowledge-driven part of the economy. How that was ever going to guarantee a role for every single worker in an economy like the UK, I don't know. But again, that all fitted in with a certain kind of liberal emphasis on education. Okay, education for a knowledge economy. That will be our role. So where are we? Are we aiming at a big state, a small state, or a smart state? Well, in answering that question, I also hope to talk about the choice between property-owning democracy and liberal market socialism. So Mill thinks we should aim at an economy with lots of worker cooperatives. And I said in the book, look, I love worker co-ops. I think they're great. If you make them legally mandatory, if we're aiming at an economy solely of worker co-ops, then the risk is this will no longer be a liberal scheme, because it will thin out the labor market, and that will erode the fair value of your free choice of occupation, which is an aspect of your basic liberty of free association. So to my critics, this seemed like a kind of principled hostility to market socialism, which was a mistake, because the workplace for them is a privileged place for the development and exercise of your democratic virtues. They say, well, you spend a lot of time there. I say, hi, I spend a lot of time asleep. You know, my bed is not a place for a privileged exercise of the democratic virtues, right? I'm just in a coma, right? Just because I'm in a workplace for a long time doesn't make it particularly democratically significant, right? I love workplace democracy. We can say exactly what Mill said. Let's leave it to the free choice of citizens, whether they want to work in a workplace that gives you a high degree of autonomy and control over your working conditions, or you can go and work somewhere crappy for more money. Now, there are limits to how crappy a Republican wants your workplace to be. They can't violate your basic liberties, and you should have a meaningful right to contest managerial decisions. For a right to contest is not the right to control. So a Republican workplace will give you a right to contest what happens to you. It's not the same as saying you should have the right to control your workplace. So the state can do all kinds of things to nudge the existence of more workplace democracies. But we really should leave this to the free choice of increasingly educated workers. And if you go down the other path, then you run the risk of forcing an expensive taste on all liberal citizens. You might choose to trade away some autonomy for more money, basically. So your workplace can be in democratic deficit. Lots of workplaces can be in democratic deficit. It gets paid off somewhere else, gets paid off in civil society, gets paid off in the fair value of your political liberties. Okay, we don't have to rely on the workplace as a privileged place for developing your associational virtues. So my friend Bob Taylor in Exit Left, Liz Anderson's remark about how the early commercial Republican thinking about the market viewed it as a device of liberation. And that spirit is still alive in Bob, right? He wants to marketize everything. But the reason he wants to marketize everything is he thinks that the commercial market can be liberating. If we structure it correctly, everyone is a price taker and not a price maker. We're equal because we're equally powerless. Okay? So this can be a kind of enthusiasm for one morally ideal institution that we associate with neoliberals, right? They love markets for the same reasons. These are domains of freedom. But now the Marxist critics of my view say, well, okay, strong rights of exit are great, but exit to what? What if you're only free to exit to unemployment, or free to exit to be exploited by a different boss? Okay. So I need to say more about something that in my book was relegated to a footnote, which is that if you're committed to justice as fairness, as I am, then you'll notice Rawls is committed to two other things that he takes to be corollaries of that. One is a commitment to full employment, and the other is a commitment to full employment secured by the state functioning as employer of last resort. So I'm now piling up a catalogue of questions. How does a property-owning Democrat view the state? What should the property-owning Democrats say about workplace democracy? What should we say about full employment? So the book very much focused on Rawls's relation to a mid-century group of Keynesians, so basically Mead and property-owning democracy. I now think we should also be taking a look at the work of Minsky, who's a slightly later renegade Keynesian. Okay, but I'll come to that. Let me just backtrack slightly. What do we mean by a property-owning democracy? Well, what's it trying to do? As a form of republicanism, it's implementing an expanded conception of what Rawls called the basic structure of society with this aim. It makes the domination of one agent by another structurally impossible. So we've learned from Philip Pettit that Republican liberty is a modally robust value. It has to apply across a range of counterfactual circumstances. So we need to design a structure that makes it impossible. Underlying this is a very Republican conception of law, where contrary to what Kevin says, if we get it right, if it's an ideally just system of law, that's an expression of your liberty and no interference. Just law expresses your liberty, it doesn't interfere with it. As it happens, I think the conception of justice we should be implementing in an expanded basic structure is a liberal conception. It's Rawls's conception. So for me, it's not a surprise when John Rawls, at the end of his career, says, property-owning democracy is a privileged way of expressing the demands of justice. Dick Dagger, got a paper from 2003, I think, saying, I, as a civic Republican, I've been thinking about these issues. My ideal social system is property-owning democracy. So you have a liberal and a Republican, different starting points, same end point. And for me, that's not a coincidence. So how do we secure these aims? Well, by modelling an economy in terms of an agent's initial endowments, where initial is not temporally prior. I'm not talking about what you temporally, prior to entering the market, do. Just talking about how you model a market in terms of agents' initial endowments. If you want a free market, you want to equalize the bargaining power of the agents on that market, and you do that by giving them fair access to capital. That also, by the way, secures the material basis of their self-respect. So in addition to the constitutional securing of the basic liberties and fair equality of opportunity, there's the constitutional securing of something else. So I say in the book, the difference principle is not itself going in the Constitution. It's the wrong kind of thing. It's not justiciable. Okay? But a kind of task specification that the difference principle fits goes into the Constitution. Why do I take this step? Well, as an avid reader of Bill Edmondson, we take this step because of what Bill calls the fact of domination, that he says should have been amongst what Rawls called the circumstances of justice. We just read political history. Okay? The wealthy tend, as an historical generalization, to exercise undue pressure on the democratic process to favor their own interests. It's not complicated. Elderly rich white men tend to favor political outcomes that benefit elderly rich white men. Max Hastings, the editor of the Daily Telegraph, I remember reading his autobiography, and he said, "Did I come under pressure from my proprietor?" Yeah, but it was amazingly crude pressure at the service of an amazingly simple worldview, right? What's good for a rich white old man is good for everyone, right? That's a well-entrenched historical tendency. Bill and I are fully in agreement that, in spite of our difference over what gets constitutionalized, we need to constitutionalize the fair value of the political liberties. What we're interested in is the preemptive dispersion of accumulations of capital. So the welfare state capitalist way of doing it is to say, let's have an insulation strategy. So my welfare state capitalist society is going to involve a negotiated settlement between different interests. There are going to be private capitalists. They're going to be wealthy. What we need to do is put up the barriers of insulation and keep money out of politics. Well, we've got some welfare state capitalist societies like America where that has spectacularly failed. And there are other ways in which money can influence politics other than campaign donations. Right? The goal here is a non-capitalist system. Why? Well, because Rawls takes over from Marx a functional understanding of capitalism. It's a society in which a small minority of citizens have monopoly control over the means of production. And that monopoly control gives them a structurally grounded social power over those who labor for income. Okay? Rawls's paradoxical solution is make everyone a capitalist. Once everyone's a capitalist, there is no exclusive small group with monopoly control of the means of production. So now your system isn't actually capitalist, as Marx understood it. We capitalize everyone. And so we've removed the power of a capitalist class. What this is, Rawls says, is a realistically utopian private property system that is not capitalist. Okay, but now we're getting to really the crux of this paper. If that's what we're aiming at, might we accidentally end up with a kind of rentier form of capitalism? So property-owning democracy has been an idea of both the left and the right. Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher are property-owning Democrats, spreading capital ownership, but not to everyone. What they actually do is expand the power of the rentier class. So in this inegalitarian version of property-owning democracy, we've moved beyond a small group of super wealthy people monopolizing the means of production, but now we've got a much more broadly based, and in that sense more politically powerful and dangerous, bourgeois rentier class shaping political outcomes in their class interests. This might be even worse than laissez-faire. Right? we might have a rentier class with such political and economic power that even within welfare state capitalism, or even in a mixed economy with the means of production in public ownership, there's still class determination of policy. And this would be the kind of ameliorative liberalism that Marx was particularly scornful towards. It's an inegalitarian liberalism at the service of bourgeois class interests, with welfare state provision as kind of social safety valve, all of which is dressed up in kind of the language of universal concern. And it's not. Well, is that what the liberal Republican ends up with, even if they aim at something else? Well, I very much hope not. To explain why, I'm going to look at some of the ideas of Hyman Minsky. I think in the background here, it's important to keep in mind something else from Bill's book. Rawls's aim is a classless society, a society that is just throughout and does not have any social classes. So one person Rawls drew on was Mead. Another person he should have drawn on, but couldn't, because Minsky's writing too late, is the work of Minsky. So I've called this section Minsky More Than a Moment, because after the financial crisis, everyone talked about the Minsky moment. As the financial crisis, as it unfolds play by play, pretty much as if Minsky had written the script. The concerns I've talked about my position are about the role of the state, but it's really about, is there any residual capacity in a property-owning democracy for workers to be exploited? And what should I say about institutional forms like workplace democracy? Interestingly, all of that's in Minsky. His book is actually really interesting. Political philosophers really should not have been ignoring it. It's not just about the financial crisis. It's not just about the financial instability hypothesis. He's got a general theory of capitalism. It's pretty much Kalecki's theory. So Minsky agrees with the main claim in Kalecki's political aspects of full employment. What's definitive of capitalist society is the social power of this broadly based rentier class. So Minsky was an interpreter of Keynes in his own right. There's another book that's specifically an interpretive book about Keynes. And Minsky shares Joan Robinson's view, that is perhaps a little impolitely expressed, that we've never implemented Keynes's ideas. We have instead implemented what Joan Robinson called bastardized Keynesianism, some half-assed version of Keynes, right, that fundamentally misunderstands Keynes's insights. Minsky says, look, socialism in the US is based on the New Deal settlement of the 1930s. That represented a non-Keynesian understanding of the causes of recessions. For one thing, those policies were in place before Keynes published the general theory. Okay? So America's New Deal settlement is not Keynesian. And in this respect, America is representative of other jurisdictions in the affluent West. What we have here is something that Minsky, with a very dry sense of humor, calls big government, or big government. What he means by big government is the tax and transfer state, whose essence is to be inflationary. Now, the first point he would make against Bill is that this big state, this big government, engages in these tax and transfer policies and performs this crucial macroeconomic function in the American economy with very little public ownership of the means of production. Okay, there's not much state ownership of key industries in the US. But there is still, in Minsky's sense, big government. What does he mean by that? Well, he means that resources are taken from productive citizens and transferred to non-productive citizens with no change in the level of productivity. And by the non-productive, Minsky includes people who work for the state, as well as the unemployed. Those who receive these resources have a higher marginal propensity to consume. So the tax and transfer state is of its very nature inflationary, as more money chases the same quantum of produced output. This has a very important macroeconomic effect. It's a form of generalized social insurance at the level of the macroeconomy. Because what tax and transfer does is put a floor under prices in the aggregate, and that's the key phrase, in the aggregate. And so, in the aggregate, you put a floor under corporate profits. Even in a recession, the state puts a floor under consumption via tax and transfer. Some of this socially guaranteed profit is clawed back from corporations via the corporation tax. And in a wonderful phrase, Minsky calls modern corporations tax farmers. So some ways of collecting tax, you outsource it to a private agent. So Cervantes was a very famous tax farmer, right? That was his job. He collected taxes for the Spanish government. Corporations are tax farmers. We guarantee in the aggregate a certain level of corporate profit, and then we claw some of it back. Big government also acts via its independent central bank as the lender of last resort. There are other things like circuit breaker measures, like stopping stock market trading in a crisis. Take all of this together, the state puts a floor under asset values. This is also, Minsky says, inflationary. Assets that the capital markets value at zero are suddenly bailed out and revalued as if they were liquid money. The state just prints and inserts into the system cash. There was no change in the productive state of the economy when you did this. So this gets us to the crux of the issue. Following Kalecki, Minsky argues that under rentier capitalism, the state puts a floor under prices. And if Robert Hockett were here, Robert would point out it actually underwrites certain key commodity prices. Okay? The state puts a floor under assets. It does not put a floor under employment. And when we ask why not, Minsky agrees with Kalecki, why not? The rentier class exercises its political power selectively to control state action. A floor under prices benefits the corporation and those with interests in corporations, either via remuneration or dividends. A floor under assets benefits the rentier directly, but a floor under employment would politically strengthen the working class in its conflict with the rentier class over the productive surplus. So let's take the so-called Phillips Curve, where there was supposed to be an essential trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Make it a little odd when you ended up with both high inflation and high unemployment, suggesting the theory behind this curve was a load of hooey. Well, what is it? It's an ideological class weapon to discipline workers. Unemployment is being used to control inflation. Now, Minsky's argument is that this is a use of unemployment to cure a disease that we impose on ourselves. So we engage in inflationary tax and transfer, a lender of last resort functions. This leads to inflation that we then control with unemployment. But this solution is completely circular. It's a solution to the problem that's the product of the state's own politically motivated decision to only underpin parts of the economy selectively. That's not macroeconomics, that's politics. What's the solution? Minsky says, well, let's just be consistent. Let's be Keynesians. The state has to maintain a buffer stock of employed citizens. Now that sounds like unpleasantly commodifying language, and I'll come back to that. The state ought to function as employer of last resort, employing everyone able and willing to work at the minimum wage. I think we should add in Rawls's requirement that this be meaningful work. But as I say, if you look at Rawls, these two commitments are there. Commitment to full employment and a commitment to the state as the employer of last resort. So I think I should have said more in my book about how the liberal Republican looks to Minsky as well as to Mead. The reason I didn't say that was that at the time I hadn't read Minsky. An ideally omniscient, counterfactual Allen, who'd read everything before writing his book, would have said, yeah, look, it's not just about universal fair access to capital, but it's also the state as employer of last resort as well as lender of last resort. So now we can start picking out the state in terms of what we want it to do. These crucial functions of the state are its sovereign capacity to put a floor under prices, assets, and employment. Let's not worry about whether it's a big state or a small state or a smart state. What do we want the state to do? Unlike in rentier capitalism, we want it to be an honest broker between different class-based interests, on the pathway to eliminating class entirely, in the way Rawls suggests. So, in a sense, worrying about neoliberalism is a red herring, because that gets us talking about rolling back the state and the state versus the market. Well, that's not the interesting issue. The interesting issue is the selective intervention of the state. The capture of the state to intervene in some sectors and not to intervene in other sectors. So, there's a very nice convergence here between some of the things Minsky's saying, some of the things Jamie Galbraith says in his explanation of why America's become such an unequal society. We're talking about selective intervention by the state that supports certain sectors but doesn't support others. Okay? State support for Boeing is very impressive because Boeing is a strategically important producer in a strategically important industry. A general services sector that employs 80% of American workers gets no state support. It gets deunionization. It gets a politically contested minimum wage. Ooh, if you put it up, you'll piss off the capitalists, right? You'll just create more unemployment. Okay? So the wage structure is allowed to collapse from the bottom. The most vulnerable workers suffer the most. The other thing the state does is have macroeconomic policies that favor finance, that favor the rentier capitalist class, that produce instability. So you just look, financial crises are not unusual, they're actually pretty common occurrences in this unstable form of capitalism. The cycle's doing this. So I think Tom Pally says, Minsky diagnoses a cycle of financial instability, but Minsky also diagnoses what Pally calls the super cycle. So we get very regular crises in capitalism, and then every 20 or 30 years, bang, we get a really big one. And 2007 was the end of a Minsky supercycle. Okay? But all of this instability harms the worst off, most vulnerable workers more than it harms those who work in highly capitalized industries working in a rent-seeking niche where the state is complicit in that. Okay? And now we're getting to, it's not incompatible with Piketty's big picture to say when you look at the actual detail of the US economy, you need to go sector by sector and firm by firm. It's not about superstar employees, it's about superstar firms. But those superstar firms are in those protected niches for political reasons. And now we're also starting to get the sense of the makers versus takers narrative. Okay? You might have a great job at Apple, but you just feel really tired. Because you may be earning $250,000, but they work you like a dog. So you're in a superstar firm. You've got a load of money. You've got a brand new house and 2 Teslas out the front. You can afford to send your kids to a Tony college. Okay, that's all great. It doesn't feel great because you're permanently exhausted. Okay, and then you're told that these poor people are going to want your money via tax and transfer. And you go, hey, I've earned this. I'm working really, really hard. It's mine, leave me alone. Okay, yeah, but you're in a protected niche. That person working in Best Buy is also working a 1,700-hour week. They're holding down 2 or 3 lousy jobs, paying lousy wages. They're also working damn hard. They're just not as lucky as you to be up there in a superstar firm. Can you say, oh yeah, well I'm better educated. Yeah, well what explains that, right? Okay. So these 2 narratives can, the Minsky story, the Galbraith story, they do complement each other. It's not that the state has been rolled back. It's been rolled back in some places, not rolled back in other places. So Keynes asked why capitalism permits desperate poverty amongst plenty. So if you've walked through Hamilton and not driven through it, that seems to be quite a good question. Why are these people so desperately poor? And why are they begging on the street? Answer, unemployment. So Minsky says, look, we have to place a floor under employment with the state functioning as employer of last resort. But there's not just a macroeconomic case for that. So I hope Robert makes it here tomorrow. In case he doesn't, I'm going to be quoting extensively from a nice paper by Robert that he's just published called Open Labour Market Operations. Do you know what open market operations are? Okay. This is how the Fed stabilizes the interest rate. So the Federal Reserve has member banks. And if there's pressure on the interest rate, then the Fed goes out and buys its own treasury securities from its member banks. That means that bank reserves expand and the interest rate goes down. Alternatively, if you want the rate to increase, the Fed sells treasury securities to its member banks. Reserves decline, okay, and the rate increases. So we're just controlling the target interest rate by the relation between the Fed and its member banks. It's buying and selling treasury gilts, so treasury bonds being bought and sold to its member banks. You're changing the composition of their reserves, so you're changing their behavior. This is a very blunt instrument of macroeconomic management. So what Robert envisages is taking that as an analogy for what he calls open labor market operations. The state is doing this on your behalf every day. There are public employees of the Federal Reserve of New York in the US going out and buying and selling bonds to their member banks in the market every day to control the interest rate. They're acting on your collective behalf. Why don't we envisage this when it comes to employment and unemployment? So Robert explicitly said he's worried about Minsky's language of a buffer stock of labor. Now, there are other Republicans worried about that language. And what Robert says, which is I think quite right, it's the rentier capitalism we're living under that is actually commodifying labor. What would it be to interpret the state as employer of last resort as non-commodifying of labor? Let's start with a quote from David Ellerman. To arrive at the natural system of property and contract, the contract to de jure transfer that which is de facto non-transferable would have to be abolished. The whole system of renting human beings in the employer-employee relation would have to be replaced by a system where everyone was individually or jointly working for themselves. So think of this as Ellerman's gloss on Polanyi saying in The Great Transformation that capitalism treats labor as a fictitious commodity. It's treating as a commodity something that can't be a commodity. Here's another quote from Ellerman. The capitalism-socialism debate was ill-posed from the beginning. It's as if the slavery debate in the 18th and 19th centuries was presented as the choice between the private and public ownership of slaves. The real choice should have been posed between any ownership of slaves, private or public, and a universal condition of self-ownership. In a similar manner, the recent debate between private and public employment, capitalism or socialism, was ill-posed. The real choice is between the employment relation, private or public, and the universal condition of individual or joint self-employment in the workplace. Universal self-employment means work without the employer-employee relation. Everyone's individually or jointly working for themselves in their place of work. Economic self-employment is the natural correlate of political self-determination or political democracy. Thus, universal self-employment is sometimes referred to as economic democracy. Here's Robert's version in his 2019 paper, Open Labor Market Operations. My labor power will not be commodified until it's directly or indirectly sold to strangers with interests that conflict with my own. Indirectly, if I'm deploying my labor to produce commodities that I sell to strangers. Directly, if I'm selling my labor itself to strangers who purchase it, so as to employ it in producing commodities or providing services for pay to yet other strangers. Under an open labor market operations regime in a democratic polity, it's effectively we who are hiring ourselves. It means we're in a certain sense self-employed, self-sufficient, and materially independent. It means we're fit to be citizens of a producer's republic, close quote. So, I think Robert's right that when we use the language of the state as employer of last resort, we're kind of envisaging it through the lens of our existing system, and we see it as a kind of playing a residual safety net role. Maybe it's a more robust safety net, maybe it's a more extensive safety net, but it's still a safety net. That's a mistake, okay? For this Republican tradition of writing about labor, let's use avowedly Kantian language. This function of the state, as employer of last resort, makes the free labor market transcendentally possible. We're putting in place the essential precondition that we, jointly and severally, employ ourselves. So it's not that the private labor market is primordially given with the public option as a kind of fail-safe. without the public option of the state as employer of last resort, the Republican doesn't view private labour markets as so much as able to make you free. So think of private labour markets as a distillation from and operating under a license granted by sovereign power, where one aspect of sovereign power is acting as the state as employer of last resort. So now we have an answer to Rusalis and Reichstad, who say a property-owning democracy only gives you a robust right to exit without answering the question, exit to what? The answer is a guarantee either of exit to other private employment on the labour market or, as an ever-present alternative, employment by the state. But this is not either the tattered safety net of laissez-faire or the robust safety net of Sweden circa 1972. It's a condition of the very existence of a market in non-commodified labour between individuals with the capacity to be held responsible for their actions and omissions. So the function of the state as employer of last resort is to make decommodified labour possible. That's really what it's doing. So there's one last question I said I'd address that I haven't yet. To what extent does the foregoing cast any light on my million defence of what we ought to say about workplace democracy? So in the book I said, yep, they're great, I love them to death, but all we should do is nudge them into existence, perhaps by tax subsidy. Leave the rest to the free choice of citizens. So what I've just said about the state as employer of last resort and its role in republicanism is now casting a light on an intramural difference in strategy. So Robert, myself, and David Ellerman all share this Republican Rousseauian ideal of a labour market. Rousseau's got a very strange notion of contract. So we intuitively think of a contract as giving something up in a transaction or a trade in return for some benefit. Rousseau famously said, when you sign the social contract, you're just as free as you were before you signed it. So go back to my earlier remark about how a just regime of law is liberty expressing. You're not left less free by a just regime of law. So Ellerman's signature claim is you can't alienate your labour from yourself even with your consent. But on Ellerman's view, that's not just a macro commitment. That has to track through so that every economic organisation has to be a workplace democracy. Otherwise, we're betraying that ideal. Robert and I are doing things differently. We're rigging the macro, then letting the micro play out as it will. Okay? So our Republican ideal is expressed by this macro form to the labour market. It doesn't track through to the micro forms of its institutional exemplification. So what this understanding of the state as employer of last resort is doing is allowing us, it gives us the space to be free to hold Mill's view about workplace democracy. Okay, so the sovereign capacity of the state has been expressed in how we've macro-structured the economy. Then we don't have to say, and every economic association should be a workplace democracy. But, since I've read Minsky, I've changed my views slightly, right? Minsky's views are incredibly internally coherent. His view of money, his Kaleckian diagnosis of the failures of Rentee Capitalism, his view of the state as employer of last resort, and how to save capitalism from itself with macroeconomic reforms. So as he says, he thinks we've never actually been Keynesian. If we were Keynesian, we would have economies that are first of all, they're basically committed to full employment. So we need institutions that are employment friendly. We want full employment, high consumption, low investment. And that has a direct bearing on whether we ought to encourage or discourage worker-owned firms. So Minsky's got all kinds of policy and institutional proposals, some of which are quite surprising. So he thinks employer contributions to employee national insurance or social security offers a standing invitation to employers to substitute machines for labour. His solution, get rid of it. Get rid of payroll taxes. Minsky says, look, the state uses corporations as tax farmers. Solution, get rid of it. Get rid of corporation tax. So since the bailouts, we've got used to the idea that the financial sector is operating all the time with a permanent public backstop, and they're trading off against it, right? These are professional risk managers, and they're not stupid people. They know they're operating against a public backstop. They take excessive risk at very high volume because they know we'll bail them out if it all blows up in their face. Hey, they were right. They were right. Minsky's point is start to think about the entire corporate sector as operating against the background of a form of social insurance in the guise of the tax and transfer big state. At the aggregate level, we use the deficit powers of the state to underwrite prices as a whole, therefore to guarantee a certain level of profit to corporations, not just banks. But now if we're engaging in that scheme, if we're offering as it were a general form of insurance to the corporate sector, we don't need then to encourage firms to build up their own selective market power. So Minsky is as anti-cartel and anti-monopoly as any German ordo-liberal, right? They've got a guarantee anyway, so they don't need to start issuing their own guarantees. Let's go back to the Galbraith point very briefly. Another point Minsky makes is that bankers want you, if you're a company, to be a monopoly. Why? They want to know there's going to be a guaranteed flow of return on the loan they just made to you. They want to know that you're actually a price setter, that you're not exposed in the market to other people determining your rate of profit. Okay? So again, we come back to our economy as a patchwork. So we've got big superstar firms with very easy access to finance. Things have now spun so completely out of control that the biggest firms don't need finance at all. Look at Apple's retained profits. It's bigger than the GDP of many countries. Right? Why do they need the financial sector? What do they do with the money? They gamble with it on the financial markets. What do the major investment banks do? Exactly the same thing. They're gambling in their own right. The reason we had a financial crisis is the major investment banks were eating their own dog food. They were involved. They were speculating. Right? That was the trouble. But note that this access to finance is selective. Right? If you're running some service-driven, labor-driven, contracted-out cleaning firm, you don't have access to finance. Right? Yeah. As Mark said yesterday, the situation we're ending up with is margins are very thin everywhere, right? And that's a really problematic situation because actually we want an economy with certain guaranteed levels of return. And that's what happened in the Trente Glorieuses, 45 to 70, right? We've got guaranteed rates of return, but that prosperity is broadly shared. But once the state started withdrawing and only certain sectors were operating under these local guarantees, now we start see the wage structure collapse from below, and we start getting very radical income disparity. So Minsky says, look, we need to keep firms at a roughly equal level of market power via institutional design and policy. Firms should be small scale, employment friendly, disinclined to replace labor with technology. So I won't go into the full range of what he says. Lots of interesting stuff. But does it alter the case for workplace democracy? Well, no. I want to stick to my basic position. Republicans do have to say something about a constitutional way of guaranteeing free labor that doesn't mean every firm has to be a workplace democracy. We're rigging the whole macroeconomy, right? But workplace democracies are good for democracy. There's no a priori reason why they should be less efficient than other corporate forms. But if we want an economy to meet our Keynesian goals of full employment, high consumption and lower investment, and given exogenous environmental constraints, either committed to zero growth or to degrowth, then it now becomes an advantage of worker-owned firms that they tend to be slow to lay off workers and reluctant to adapt to new technologies that lead to redundancies. So, if we want to change the fundamental structure of our economy, maybe having a lot more worker-owned, employee-owned associations is a way to go to realize our macro goals. Okay? Nevertheless, I'm still not convinced that we have to make them legally mandatory across the board. So let me wrap things up. This has been a somewhat self-indulgent paper since I've been defending myself against various objections. So something I already said at very great length. But I think I was right to be pressed on some of the intellectual resources of liberal republicanism. Like Rawls, I'm interested in rejecting welfare state capitalism. Therefore, I'm not interested in a property-owning democracy distorted into a generalized, inegalitarian version of rentier capitalism at the service of bourgeois class interests, which I think perfectly encapsulates what Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher were up to. Right? Rawls's realistically utopian ideal of freely associating producers is a classless society. We're going to get there by acknowledging that the state has certain key sovereign functions that it cannot implement merely selectively. The implementation of a constitutional guarantee of fair and universal access to capital is certainly crucial, but so is consistency in underwriting prices, assets, and employment, and bringing about the state's effective discharge of these key functions. If we neglect them, then we're neglecting the constitutive function of the state. Okay? It's neither an honest nor a dishonest broker between social interests. It's not an interest amongst other interests. Some sovereign functions are, as it were, game constituting. Right? That's why we're doing constitutional engineering here. The state's just not an agent in the game, it's constituting the game. And if we neglect that sovereign function of the state, then we're going to make avoidable mistakes. Okay, that's it.
I'll take the cue, and as usual, Jorge will have the first question.
It's now known as the Jorge question, I believe.
The first one, yes. Thank you very much. I have two questions. One about the normative value of property, and the second about labor as an asset in an economy of in an automatized world. The first one is about, it seems like a presupposition of this analysis that property is an already ingrained concept in everybody that's going to be playing the game, sort of speaking. Now, when we engage with property as it was developed in the West, you end up with results like the native populations in Canada, where nomadic people were forced into a capitalist system, and levels of alcoholism and the destruction of their culture ensued. Not that different from what happened in the Amazon, where the only experience that natives from the Amazon had from capitalism was being enslaved by their rubber lords in the early 20th century, and nowadays, pipelines being installed in their lands. Yesterday, native bands got together and speared engineers in the Amazon of Peru, because their experiences with capitalism have been atrocious. And even if it was the big compression, somebody was profiting from the damaging of these communities. So capitalism seems to be part of the debate, to be, at least property seems to be normatively loaded in this sense. And I'll give you the second question because it's smaller, so you can answer all of them. The second is, with the sanctions that Trump put on China, China committed $47 billion to become independent from the West. $47 billion to advance technology that was supposed to take us like 20 years. They want to get there in 10 years. That's going to lead to further automatization. And if we're still thinking in terms of labor as an asset, what's the automatization of the marketplace going to look like? Or how is our economy going to look like when we don't need labor? Because a lot of robots are going to be taking over. Not immigrants, robots. We might have to hate somebody else now. Thank you.
Okay, so is capitalism inherently dependent on colonial exploitation? So there are various simplifying idealizations. Okay, so as we know, theory of justice is it's just one state, no migration. You're born into it and you die to leave it. That's Rawls's key simplifying assumption, which of course has very deep implications for his view. It's why his view of justice is both stringent but very limited, and why, in his sense, society is not a voluntary association. And that explains why he's not a contract theorist. He says he's a contract theorist. It's a very odd contract. You can't contract in, you can't contract out. You can't choose whether you're born, you can't choose whether you die. Well, you can, but... So we get the transnational version of the law of peoples. Well, what really matters to a people is its sovereign self-determination. As I said, he's a statist. He doesn't talk about the payment of reparations for past wrongs between societies, but I don't see any reason why the framework can't be extended to saying, actually, Britain owes India quite significant reparations. Britain owns lots of countries quite significant reparations. We benefited from colonialism. It was basically theft. We should be making reparative payments. I don't have any problem with saying that. The views we're talking about are not very entwined in actual history. Is there a case for reparations? Yes, there is. It's a certain Lockean notion of appropriation that was used in the arguments for imperial and colonial domination. So, hey, these people are nomads. They're not improving the land. Well, here we come back to the notion of a fictitious commodity, right? Land is exogenously given. Sorry, yes, it's exogenously given, right? There's one strand I haven't talked about in the property-owning democracy tradition. It's another strand from Mill. It's a strand from Henry George that says, land is never made more productive. Land simply is. So our prima facie assumption, the default should be, it's collectively owned. So this is the reasoning behind sovereign wealth funds as producing a social dividend for a given society. Now there's luck involved in that thought. Perhaps you don't have any sovereign wealth. Perhaps you're lucky to be Norway or Dubai, and you're unlucky to be a society without any natural resources. It's also of its nature unsustainable because you basically dig it up and sell it. It's not a sustainable form of capitalism. There's the sovereign wealth intuition. Then there's this much broader intuition about the category of land as a factor of production. There may be a factor of input into production, but you don't make it more productive in spite of what the property developers say. So there's a renegade strand of property-owning Democrats. So Gavin Kerr has got a book called The Property-Owning Democracy. That's a defense of the Henry George view. So basically we sequester land in all its forms and generate a social dividend from it. And then beyond that, you can be as crazily capitalist as you like. So Weil and Posner seem to have a very similar view. They're Chicago school libertarians, but they also want to appropriate land in this Georgist way and generate social dividend from it. Land, seizing land from people because they're nomads and not making the land productive, that sounds like a little self-serving and circular account of the nature of land, right? So we don't have to take those. I mean, look, these Lockean justifications were given for appropriating Australia and appropriating American territory. We just don't actually believe that stuff anymore. Automation. So, the philanthro-capitalist class is now suddenly in favor of unconditional basic income. Because Elon Musk has worked out that all his millions aren't going to help him if he gets strung up from a lamppost. So for me, this is just another form of safety valve, amelioration of social discontent. Okay, UBI is an extremely bad idea. Minsky, not coincidentally, is a stringent critic of unconditional basic income. You will not be surprised to hear he thinks it inflates out. This is a very awkward problem for proponents of UBI. So he says several very interesting things. As usual, leisure is meaningless to a poor person. All these homeless people wandering the streets of Hamilton have got a lot of leisure. That means nothing to them because they haven't got any money. Okay, what a UBI does is give you leisure and money. That's why so many people are going to opt out of the labour market, and that's why to tempt you back in, wages are going to have to be driven up quite considerably. And then the story is, how are we going to make up the productivity gap? Well, we just will, is what the proponents of UBI say. We're just all suddenly going to be more productive, and that'll close that gap. No, you're going to get rampant inflation that's going to eat away the benefits of a UBI. So we should be aiming for meaningful full employment instead of a UBI. We should be pushing back against automation. We should not be allowing the private rentier class to say, yeah, I can't be bothered to pay an employee contribution via your payroll tax every month. I'm just going to pay tax on a machine once that replaces you. So our tax system incentivizes automation. It incentivizes the replacement of employment by machines. Why? Why? Should not be up to the private rentier class to make that policy decision, right? So Minsky's got views, maybe slightly dotty views. Yeah, abolish corporation tax, abolish social security, and abolish national insurance in the UK, get rid of tax farming by corporations, get rid of a tax on employing people that corporations simply pass through to prices. So find a different way of doing it. So he's consistently anti-automation, as we should all be.
Mark. So I was going to start with a question, but I'll try and build on what you just raised there. So the funny thing about the automation one is it's a bit like sort of MMT's a bit like the left-wing Laffer curve. You know, once you've got this meme in your head, you can't let it go regardless if it doesn't work or not. And it's the same with automation. So I spent some time actually looking at real numbers on this stuff. And number one, it hasn't happened. And yet we talk as if it's hard. And there's a brilliant example of performativity in this during the crisis, whereby, I mean, it's sort of incidental, I guess, that in 2008 the whole world goes to hell in a handbasket. And in 2010, all those people who are unemployed start reading in the newspaper every day that they're all about to be replaced by robots. And one of the first sectors that was meant to go was truck drivers. So basically by 2015, we would have had these trucks on the road. And as a consequence of that, the United States truck fleet is now running at over 100% capacity. And the industry has shot 120,000 drivers. And they've had the highest wage gains in the United States. Because all those people in 2012 went, I'm not going to get an HGV license, what's the point? I'm going to be replaced by a robot. And it simply hasn't happened. This is simply investor bullshit. It's like blockchain, crypto, all this stuff is just investor horseshit. The number of American firms that have AI in their firm is 2%. And all AI is, really, is basically fair Isaac credit scoring with much bigger data sets and much bigger computers. So stop. It's just not true. And if you live in a climate-shocked world, the notion that we're actually going to not need labour to basically dig ditches and build walls is hilarious. There's no robots for that. Right? This is all investor crap. So I just wanted to get that out there because I think it's really damaging. In terms of the talk, thank you for putting the best case out there for the fourth floor, if you want to put it that way, that I've actually heard. Have you told Bernie this? Because he can't explain it that way. And I think that you should. I think it's very important.
I'll send him a copy.
Yeah, exactly. So my only question on this is, all of this, and this is Minsky, and again, congratulations for reading all of Minsky carefully, because it's fucking unreadable. I mean, it's just, it really is painful to get through. He's a horrible writer. Right?
He is.
But despite all that, Mrs. Lincoln, the play was quite good. So all of Minsky relies essentially on a closed economy model, just as Rawls relies, if you will, on a closed polity model. And it really matters when you open it up, particularly for the inflation constraint. So I'm just wondering, because I haven't thought it through myself, right? Can we think through what happens if we live in a world of structurally low inflation, given both the globalization of labour markets and supply chains, etc.? And I can imagine a world where 10, 15 years from now, if you follow the populist movement through, you renationalise, and what that enables you to do is create those dynamics. You do these inflationary dynamics. But what happens in a world in which you've got structurally low rates and structurally low inflation? Then those inflation dynamics don't work. Right? So that's the first one. And then the second one is, how do you actually explain all this to people who then turn around and say, but why do you do the jobs guarantee when most of the time the United States is at full employment anyway? What's the quick way of getting to the chase on this one? How would you explain it?
Right, so we have, the UK is virtually at full employment, right? A lot of those jobs are shitty muck jobs. So now we turn to meaningfulness and quality. Okay? So it's not as if Minsky didn't say that the bastardized Keynesianism wasn't kind of getting things right in the sense that a stopped clock is right twice a day. Okay? So we accidentally have full employment. But when you look down at labour market participation rates, 0-hours contracts, precariousness. There's a lot of very, very poor quality jobs, right? So it's the wrong kind of full employment is what I'm going to say, right? UK, Germany, USA, similar picture. Then we go to Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, very different story. Go to France, different story. So some economies have eliminated unemployment, but only by putting in the wrong kind of full employment that follows the Galbraith picture of the fissured and fractured workplace, where some sectors are in lucrative rent-earning niches. If it's a strategically important industry, if Silicon Valley was guaranteed certain rents because the US state thought that for imperial reasons, that was a very important sector, right? The nature of firms has changed. So the doctrine of shareholder value drives the internal disintegration of the firm, where non-essential services get outsourced to produce some of the worst jobs. So, being pretentious gits, Microsoft call their HQ their campus. Well, you're driven around the campus in shuttle buses by people earning less than the minimum wage. That's been outsourced. So you've got these stock option programmers who are all worth multi-millions of dollars and who do work very, very hard, being driven around by people who also work very hard, but you're doing crappy jobs for virtually no money. So, it's not a triumph if there's a lot more of that category of shitty muck job around. So you need to look, and also the shitty muck jobs do actually drive a lot of people off the labour market. So I'm just going to say, look, it's the wrong kinds of reasons. I'm actually much more autark. I'm a bit of a globalization skeptic, I must admit. I think we were sold a bundle of goods that I don't fully believe. One of the reasons I read another very bad book, which is John McCain's memoir, is because he does actually come out there and say, globalization is like the weather. You can't change it, you can't fight it, it's like the weather. Okay, so it's a Polanyian classic false naturalization. Globalization is just this natural phenomenon like hurricanes or rising sea levels. You can't do anything about it, you can't fight back against it, you can't resist it, you can only adjust to it. It's like just put the right clothes on when you go out, right? So I think that's all been pretty ideological. Look, I think America's capitalist elite has found a new proletariat to exploit. Its own is irrelevant. Its own is irrelevant. If you're poor and working class in America, the message from America's elite is, well, we've found Chinese people to replace you now. You are on the scrap heap. So, pass the OxyContin, you are just not, this isn't a country. You are not relevant to me. Co-citizenship doesn't matter because I'm a capitalist first and an American second. So this state has the capacity to underwrite global capitalism. It's what it does. And your primary duty is to the system. And they tell themselves the story that you put up of the macro aggregate. Yeah, okay, so people are dying from deaths of despair in Virginia. But hey, look at the Vietnamese middle class. There is a process going on in history and across the globe. And we're actually humanitarians. Because we're actually the people who care about the global poor, because this process will lift eventually in 500 years' time the very worst off up into a decent standard of living. So I'm much more autarkic. I think globalization tends to be slightly exaggerated in its impact. I don't deny get deep globalization in financial markets. I think in trade pretty much everyone's a mercantilist, right? It's just how good at it they are, right? Do they succeed or do they? No one's trading for moral reasons or collective solidarity reasons. I mean, there's a book out there by Aaron James in which he tries to say global trade is a game of mutual assurance. I think that's actually pitching it a little high. I think they're more like cooperative ventures for mutual advantage than they are games of mutual assurance. Everyone's playing the mercantilist game. It's just that China and Germany are really good at it. And other countries are less good at it. And not everyone can win. right? Because it's not, this is a zero-sum game. So, yeah, when Galbraith says, look, the state is only selective in the way it relates to the wage structure, and then it permits macro instability over the very long run. Part of that macro instability is America's relationship to trade and globalization and financial flows. That's just been yet another disruptive factor that's just worsened the instability and worsened the situation for poor Americans, who've just been thrown under the Chinese bus, right? Sorry to sound like the orange shit gibbon, but he's not always wrong.
So then do they need to pull it back and basically break up these supply chains and onshore and all the
Yes.
rest of it?
Yes.
And then, in a sense, but I mean, the weird thing is sort of like the giant orange shirt given is the most likely to put a wage floor in, ironically.
Yes.
Right. Just as Boris is most likely to basically do a shit version of MMT.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
You know that stop clock that's right twice a day?
Yeah.
You can get good policies and the correct policies from the very worst people you wish were in charge of the process.
We've got a few people in the queue. We've got about 6 minutes left. Dan, and then it's Nathan, Fernando.
We started late. Nobody's going to die if we don't have 1 till 12.
I can hear Stefan's stomach from here.
Dan.
Thank you very much. Very interesting paper, a lot to chew on. I have to admit that I fixated on this notion of workplace democracy and what role and to what extent it might have in this macroeconomic shift towards TOD.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have 3 interrelated questions. Time constraints, you can choose to
Mm-hmm.
answer one, some, or none of them.
Mm-hmm.
So the first question was, just very briefly, what your thoughts were on this German model of mediating between labor-capital relations. And there's a word for it, I can't remember it, but...
Co-determination.
Yes, so you're familiar with...
Mitbestimmung, if you want to go German.
So just to recapitulate for everyone that maybe doesn't know it, this idea that I believe the German state mandates, correct me if I'm wrong, that firms over a certain number of employees require that, I think it's on their managerial board or something like that, a certain number of workers to sit on it that are elected democratically from amongst their own. What your thoughts are on that and what role that might play in this, if any, and whether that question even makes sense in the general thrust of your paper is contingent on how exactly you're understanding workplace democracy. So earlier on I had the sense that what this might mean, for you at least, is something similar to that, co-determination, or maybe something a bit stronger than that, but not quite, both ownership of the firm and making democratic decisions from amongst the workers as to how that firm's going to go forward. So maybe just trying to clarify.
So there are several things out there. So one is kind of Schweikert style. Workplace cooperatives lease their capital from the state for a capital usage fee. That's one way of doing it. Then there's the kind of the John Lewis partnership model where every worker is a partner in their workplace. The worry about these different ways of doing it are some of them don't seem of their nature particularly egalitarian. So the John Lewis story, you know, you're very much invested in your firm, but you're still in a competitive market economy where your aim is to seek profit at the expense of other firms, right? The Schweikert story, there are worries about the relationship between the current cohort of employees and the firm as a corporate entity that outlasts the individual working life of an individual. So why doesn't the current cohort bleed the capital down to zero? Because that's in their interests. Why don't they cheat on the lease fee from the state? That's also in there. So there's all kinds of principal agent problems. Co-determination, look, there's a lot to admire about German capitalism. It's got lots of small and medium enterprises. Not many cartels and monopolies. As Mark said, there's lots of old family-owned firms in Germany. 50% of these firms are not listed, but they're in the SME range. They're in the small and medium range. Germans aren't obsessed with their house as their primary investment asset. They rent and they invest in these firms. Right? So that it's a kind of broadly based capitalism. Very nice union system with very large cross-sectoral unions. That's very powerful for labour. If you can have union representation that goes across, if every truck driver's in a truck drivers union, no matter what industry you're in. Okay, so that greatly strengthens labour against capital. That's all good. Co-determination in particular, I think I'm just going to repeat my kind of Galbraith point. Maybe we shouldn't, that's for kind of quite Tony parts of the economy anyway. Okay, that's co-determination in a large, successful multinational corporation that's probably doing okay anyway. We really need to be worried about the office cleaner, who's probably a Turkish migrant. Okay, so, having lived in the Netherlands, that's pretty much what it is. The gastarbeiter are there to do the jobs that the Dutch don't want to do. They're not unionized. They're not in a particularly strong position. They're at the very bottom end of the distribution. They've got zero bargaining power unless they're unionized. Co-determination is great, but it might just be applying in context where there isn't really much of a problem anyway. My wife used to be a corporate lawyer. She's an art historian now. When she was a corporate lawyer, it was just, well, if it's a German company, you're very careful about what you let get to the board in the first place. So if it gets to the board discussion, the workers will see it and the workers will have a view. So you just don't let it get to the board. Okay, if there's something you want to do that's really sneaky, then you just make sure it doesn't get to the Mitbestimmung discussion.
Can I add just one thing on that, just if you're interested in this? It's actually much worse than that. So first of all, the real effective participation rate is very, very low. But the whole thing is based upon Germany does exports. So firms in the export sector have a lot of Mitbestimmung going on, because the interests of basically capital and labour are aligned, which is everybody else who's not in the export sector should be on low wages, because that makes us competitive. Therefore, we rent seek off the whole of the rest of society. So when you see it that way, it's actually kind of a really parasitic model, and it's not universal at all.
And it fits the Galbraith story. Yeah. If you win the Champions League in soccer, you get to go and play South America's champions. So there's this kind of global champion of champions. Germany views themselves as Europe's export champion. Okay, for the society that contains Jürgen Habermas, who tells us nationalism is disgraceful because Germany has a shameful past. I have a German friend who said he grew up ashamed to be German. And I said, you serious? Kant, Beethoven, Schiller, and you're ashamed to be German? Are you insane? Well, that's how I was brought up to be. It is shameful to be German because we inflicted Nazism on the world, and Habermas tells us it's basically shameful to be German. You can be identified with the German constitution. You can't be identified with the German nation because that's all, swastikas and... Okay, that's completely crazy. But this country that claims to have eschewed nationalism has pursued its national interest in a very thorough and determined way. Reunification was a nationalist project. And the way Germany has absorbed all those poorly educated workers from the East is by attaching them to the mercantilist project. And all that's happened is the tentacles of the cheap labor German supply chain have pushed into Eastern Europe. So East Germany I shouldn't say colonized. East Germany got colonized by West Germany, and that process is pressed further east. So your Skoda, made in Poland and the Czech Republic. Okay. So in the process, I happen to think they've destroyed the EU. Because this machine is not built to cross-subsidize weak trading partners in the South when everything goes wrong. Okay, if the rising tide keeps rising, the German machine kept doing what it was supposed to do. As soon as the downturn in the Eurozone, once you've taken the insane step of binding all your currencies together in a single currency, then Germany had no choice but to throw its erstwhile trading partners under the bus. And they did. And they did. They've got a debt break in their constitution, right? When Mario Draghi said, we will do whatever we need to do to mutualize European debt, the Bundesbank said, okay, we're going to sue you for that. We're going to take you to court for saying that. because we insisted there was to be no mutualized debt in the Eurozone. The Eurozone has no lender of last resort because the Germans simply will not tolerate it. They're not going to underwrite Euro bonds where we mutualize the economic position of Germany and Greece. They're just not going to do it. Okay, so having signed up for this crazy scheme, which was working as long as the Eurozone economy was booming, as soon as there was a downturn, it disintegrated. And this is where the next financial crisis is probably going to come from, right? Because debt overhang, no debt forgiveness, built into the DNA of the Eurozone. So yeah, co-determination is great, but it's a tiny sector of an otherwise, well, of an admirable form of capitalism with some dangerous tendencies. But it's like, everyone's a mercantilist, right? It's just they're better at it. Because BMWs are cool.
I do have more, like, another question or two, but I'll save it for...
Yeah, let's save it, and let's get Nathan in on.
Habermas was even wary of cheering for the German football victories because they weren't the German state, they were the German people. Anyway, my question is about the Republicanism.
Yep.
So maybe this is answered in Republic of Equals, but it sounded like Pettit's notion of Republican freedom was doing the work at the political level. But then when you started talking about workplace democracy, Rousseau was back in the mix.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering,
Yeah.
like, because if you get Pettit, you probably don't need full workplace democracy because your interests can be aligned with the people who are exercising authority over you, whereas
Correct.
Rousseau's whole thing is there can't be authority.
Absolutely.
So I'm wondering, like, I don't know, do you think Rousseau's version is specifically appropriate to the economic sphere, or how they hang together, basically?
That's an absolutely brilliant question. You've put your finger right on it, right? So technically, if there's to be a synthesis of Rawlsian liberalism and republicanism, it has to be Roman republicanism. Okay, it's got to be the Pettit version. It's going to be Pettit's version of republicanism, but with Rawls's quite radical economic consequences. Pettit is not in the least bit economically radical. He's a consequentialist, he's a utilitarian, he's some kind of welfare state capitalist. He's quite happy with high levels of inequality. You might do something if some people are outrageously rich. That's part of the Republican tradition. If the senators get too powerful, you should do something about it. Not a fan of the crowd. So John McCormick calls him oculophobic, right? He doesn't actually trust the people very much, which is why they're hedged about with all these institutions, because the people are the uneducated plebs who are a little bit out of control, right? At least they're hard to control. So the liberal Republican should be combining neutralist liberalism with Roman republicanism. But now I'm saying some things about the constitution of work that sound like the Athenian, Rousseauian Republican. So am I contradicting myself? Because I'm actually committing myself to a controversial ethical ideal. So if you're a Rousseauian Republican, you think political participation is part of the good life. If you don't participate in politics, you're leading a bad life. Okay, as Charles Taylor will tell you. If you don't participate, then you're a bad person. That's not what the liberal says. So can I have my cake and eat it? I'm trying to, because what I usually say is that I'm talking about agency interests. I'm trying to secure your robust agency. And that is not itself an ethical conception. Okay, what is the nature of your effective agency? How do I protect your agency? So this conception of rigging the macroeconomy with the state as employer of last resort to guarantee liberty on the labour market, I'm securing your effective interests as an agent. I'm not importing some controversial ethical story about collective self-determination, where if you're not actively directing political outcomes all the time, so Rousseau says you're only free when you vote, then for the next 5 years the English person is a slave. Okay? If you're not actually engaged all the time in political determination, that's an ethical fault. So I don't think I'm trying to have my cake and eat it in a fairly blatant way. But that's what I'd say to try and ward off your excellent question, which is, have I crossed the line into an ethically controversial Athenian republicanism? I hope not. But it's a very good question.
Let's sneak in two more questions. Fernando and then Matt.
Thank you for your talk. I have two questions. They're interrelated, and they're kind of quick, so kind of I I still haven't understood so well. What is your strategy for giving meaningful employment at using the state as an employer of last resort? Because when we have this floor for corporation activity, this simulates consumption, and at the very least, the firms will hire more workers. So, in this way, you can grant some sort of employment. And the second question would be that you mentioned the Phillips Curve fallacy, but in my country, Brazil, we try to counter the effects from the last economic crisis, and one of the measures taken by the government was to try to guarantee full employment at the expense of inflation. So inflation went out of control, and for countries that are not the U.S., I think this might actually be a problem. How to counter inflation when trying to keep full employment?
Right, well, I mean, as Mark's presentation yesterday, the 1970s in the US saw high inflation and high unemployment, which is like not supposed to happen, because that's what the curve tells us really can't happen, right? So the view appears to be, look, I'm not an economist, the view appears somewhat dubious if empirical reality simply doesn't conform with the prediction. So in a sense, Minsky, this is coming back to full employment for the right reasons. Okay, so Minsky wants an economy with full employment, high consumption, and low levels of investment. So if you say, well, we can do this entirely by stimulating consumption, it doesn't matter if the state function of employer of last resort doesn't end up employing very many people. Well, I don't think Minsky would be unhappy about that. If it was zero, we'd be perfectly happy with it, provided people are getting the right kind of employment. And that's where we came back to Mark's point that there's several economies at the moment that have eliminated joblessness, but then you need to look down at the nature and quality of the work being done. He was all in favor of, New Deal schemes. I mean, this does tie into Mark's agenda of addressing climate change. How much infrastructural work is there to be done by people who are now simply unemployed that we pay for by hitting a keystroke over there in the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England, or we can find money, well, the American we. If I were an American, I could find money to invade Iran tomorrow without troubling America's very wealthy people by putting their taxes up. That wouldn't be a problem, but apparently fighting climate change, the first question is, how are you going to pay for that? How are you going to pay for that? I mean, you need to balance the budget. How are you going to pay for that? Minsky is a balanced budget person, interestingly. He says you do actually need to keep that fiscal compact. People need to believe you have an effective tax-raising regime that could, over time, discharge any deficit. But could is important. So the Bank of England just paid off a debt from the Napoleonic War. Been rolled over for quite a long time, from 1815 to about 2000 or something. States can maintain deficits for a very long time, provided you believe they could pay it off. And the state uniquely can commit the unborn to meet its future obligations, right? That's one of its sovereign powers. So, provided the function of putting a floor under employment is there, if the floor under prices does all the work, great. Minsky would be very happy. He just doesn't think history encourages optimism on that point, because it does look as though we maintain structurally high unemployment to discipline workers. I mean, go and examine the horrors of the American welfare state system. The message is very simple, right? Even the shittiest job is better than being on welfare. That's why it's so awful. That's why it's so Foucauldian and horrible, right? We want you in work, no matter how bad the job is. Well, that's plenty of reasons not to think that's a good way to do it.
Matt, you want to?
Sure, yeah, I know we're out of time. So I just, mine might be kind of an easy thing. I just wanted to hear a little bit more about how you distinguish yourself from the stakeholder starting gate theory. In terms of it sounded like you wanted to say it's not starting gate because you have ongoing access to capital.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to hear what that looks like, or maybe a couple of ideas of what that might look like.
Sure. So, well, I implement the difference principle. And I'm implementing the difference principle not via tax and transfer. It's not a redistributive principle. All three principles taken together are predistributive. Okay? I'm rigging market outcomes by giving people the material basis of their self-respect, by giving people ongoing access to capital. Now, how the different parts of the story fit together is quite interesting. So how responsibility sensitive is this? So if I give you a demogrant and you go and blow it, do I replenish your capital stock? I could do my MMT trick and just keep hitting the keystroke and keep replenishing your capital stock. Now we get into a discussion about responsibility and moral hazard. And so I kind of don't commit I'm a coward. I don't commit myself on that, right? There are different possible ways you can envisage this playing out. So Robert is actually very responsibility sensitive. Okay, I think because responsibility is a philosophical quagmire, I do not voluntarily wade into that. If you ask me to put a very thin line through my life choices and tell me what's luck, what's chance, what's responsibility, what's choice, I'm a Bernard Williams student, so I'm going to say, hey, that's really hard. Probably most of what I choose is in a sense not freely chosen, right? It's very hard to insert that responsibility. The luck egalitarians think we are able to put that chance and choice line in a very precise place. I'm just a bit of a free will skeptic, so if I don't have to walk into that quagmire, I'm not going to, okay? In principle, we could endlessly replenish your capital stock. So you keep going out, making terrible decisions, blowing your capital, and I just give you more, I just give you more, I just give you more. There's a sense in which the welfare state's doing that already, right? The insurance state does that already. There are some insurance choices that you can't alienate yourself from. So I've got lots of war stories from my wife's time in the city, right? So an American firm called her up and said, we're moving into the UK market, and our business is buying pensions from soldiers who've left the army in their 30s and 40s. And she said, that doesn't sound
Right.
like the sort of thing that's very, very lucrative, because these people, they take bad decisions because they're not very well socialized or institutionalized. So they have trouble finding work, and immediate cash is very attractive for them. So, we buy their pension at a fraction of the value of the pension, then we put them all together and we securitize them, and it's a steady flow and it's very lucrative. And she said, can I get back to you on that? So she rings the UK pensions regulator, who says, no, it's illegal. Can't do it in the UK. All this, we support our troops, bullshit. They leave the forces and get shafted. Shafted by Wall Street, right? Fine. In the UK, the state does not permit you to engage in that irresponsible, short-termist gambling with your pension. That's off the agenda. Okay, so that's a kind of asset speculation that we don't let you do in Britain. So yeah, I haven't committed myself to the cornucopia view of your capital asset, where I keep topping it up, or whether I have a more responsibility-sensitive, market-sensitive. If you take enough bad decisions, I'll let you fall a certain way to teach you a lesson, Tomasi style.